Hello everyone, welcome to our stream. We'll get started in just a second here. All right, let's see. See if we can get this window open here and then we can begin. Hello, King Abdullah. Welcome as more people start to come in. Hello, Victoria. Hello, Renee. Hello, Child Prodigy. Welcome, everyone. For whatever reason, my other stream is not starting. Interesting. All right, let's just go live now. See if that helps. All right, that did it. All right, once again, welcome everybody. See who we've got here in the room real quick. I said hello already to a few of you. Hello, Anne-Marie. Hello, Rohan, Diego, James Brown. Hey, what's going on? Welcome everyone to today's Friday afternoon or Friday morning or Saturday night, depending on where you are in the world, stream. My name is Terry White, Worldwide Design and Photography Evangelist for Adobe. It's my pleasure to be streaming to you live today with today's topic being all about layers. Layers are very, very useful in all of our applications that support layers. And today we're going to not only take a look at just some of the basics of how layers work, but more importantly, what you can take advantage of in each of the applications when it comes to layers. So that's pretty much what we're going to be doing today. Hello, Matthew. I see you over there. And welcome everyone else. So I could spend time just doing shout outs, but I think it's probably time to get to the task at hand. So let me go ahead and switch over to my computer. And that way you guys will be able to see what I'm going to be doing. I've got all the applications open. So I've got Photoshop open. Here's Adobe Illustrator. Here's Adobe InDesign. Here's Adobe Muse. And the one thing they all have in common is that I didn't mean to launch Lightroom though. The one thing they all have in common is that they have a, hang on, let me quit out of this. They have a layers panel, and the layers panel allows you to work in a more organized manner. And not only in a more organized manner, but depending on the application, a more protected manner. So that means that, for example, if I were working on a photo like the one I have now, I could work on parts of the photo right on top of other parts of the photo without disturbing the photo underneath. So for example, if we look at this particular photo in Photoshop, it's got a couple of layers just for the trains. In other words, those trains were dropped in after the fact because we can see railroad tracks underneath. I don't think that those were cloned. I think those are the actual pictures before the train were taken. Now, of course, that could have just simply been done a couple of different ways. That could have been done with just someone standing there on a tripod with the camera on a tripod taking a photo without the train. And then as soon as the trains appeared, they took a picture with the trains. But I can tell by the way this particular one is kind of flying off the tracks that was not the case, or at least for this particular one, it wasn't the case. But in any manner, no matter how this was originally captured, the point is this has been segmented out into layers so that it would be easier to work on one part of the layer or the other. Now, like I said, we're going to talk about layers in general across the board, but we'll come back to Photoshop at the very end to talk about some more Photoshop specific things. Because of all the applications that I mentioned, Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign, and Muse, Photoshop probably has the most, I'm trying to find the right word. I don't want to say the most technical, but the most, the layers panel with the most options. Let's put it that way. So, because there are more than one kind of layer in Photoshop to begin with, and there are all kinds of options that you can do per layer. So, whereas InDesign layers and Muse's layers are probably the most basic, Photoshop's layers are the most, I don't like using words complex, but the most feature rich, let's put it that way. So with that said, let's pop over and take a look at, or actually before we leave Photoshop, let's take a look at a basic example of how layers work. And then we'll go into some more sophisticated examples. So for example, on the layers panel right here, I've got the background, which is just the scene with the tracks on it. I've got a layer for each train. Then you see something that looks like a layer with no eye in front of it. That means that layer is turned off. It's there, it's just not visible right now. And then you start seeing folders. And these folders are called layer groups. And that's what I mean by just, Photoshop has a lot of different options when it comes to layers. And we haven't even gotten to adjustment layers and all the other kinds of layers that we can do with Photoshop. But let's just turn off everything and just start with the background. All right, so the background, just like any other photo you would just open with just the background. There wouldn't be all this stuff above it. There would just be the background layer. At any given time, you can either add a layer manually just by going down to the new layer icon in any of the applications. Just click the new layer icon, you'll get a brand new layer, usually above the layer you're on. Or, depending on the application, by bringing in new elements will automatically generate layers. So for example, if I were to go over to the type tool and click the type tool and just click, it would put a cursor there. I could type whatever I wanted, but that new text that I just put in would become a new type layer or text layer. So sometimes layers are generated for you. Sometimes you'll create them on your own. And of course, yes, robust is a good word, thanks. Sometimes you'll create them, on your own, sometimes they'll be generated for you. It just depends on what you're doing. So for example, if I wanted to protect this background scene, then I should probably create a layer above it. If I didn't, which I have not yet, if I grab the, let's see what's going on. Oh, this particular layer is locked. Okay, if I grab the paintbrush icon and I start painting on this tree, I am now painting at 19% opacity red, and I am physically damaging or physically changing those pixels. And if I save and quit and move out of this, there's no recovery. Hey, Jason Levine. Jason Levine's in the house. Welcome. Happy Friday, Jason. AKA Beetlejuice. You guys should go check out Jason's. Just click, if you're on YouTube, go ahead and click on Jason's link and follow his YouTube channel as well. But anyway, if I now start, if I close this, save it, quit, and I open this back up, those pixels are permanent. That's it. They're done. They're now red. I would have to figure some way to change the color back. So I'm going to quickly undo that so that I don't make that mistake. Now, on the other hand, if I go ahead and create a layer first, just by clicking that new layer icon, of course, it doesn't know what I want to call it. So it just starts naming them layer 1, layer 2, so forth and so on. Now, if I do the exact same thing, I get the exact same effect, but the difference is I am changing this tree to red, and I am not damaging the tree itself because I just did all that paint on that layer, which you can barely see because it's 19%. But that paint is now just on a layer all by itself. So at any given time, save the file, close the file, come back tomorrow. I can turn that layer back off, turn that layer back on. I can see where I kind of got a little crazy and went off the tree trunk a little bit. So I could either erase or mask. If I can find my eraser here. There it is. I can erase that paint right off, and it's not erasing anything other than the paint itself. So that's how layers in Photoshop have worked since Photoshop 3. Photoshop 3 was the first version of Photoshop to get layers. Not CS3, Photoshop 3, back in the 90s. So before that, you didn't have layers. You just did everything on the background and prayed you got it all right, because you didn't have this convenience of, I can paint on a layer all day long, do anything on a layer all day long, and it won't affect my original photo. So that's how layers were originally created to work in Photoshop. And of course, that makes sense. That I would love being able to use these clear pieces of, like I used to teach it, these clear pieces of acetate that build up over my photo. I could have as many layers as my computer can support, and work and not ever disturb anything else. So I could call that the red tree layer. I could create another layer above it and call it the pink railroad tracks and paint that, or do whatever I wanted to make changes to that. And of course, layers can be duplicated. So a lot of times you'll have a person that will say, well, I want to make changes to the actual background, but I want to always be able to get back to the original background. So what they'll do is drag the layer they want to duplicate onto the new layer icon, and that will make a copy. So I just made a copy of that layer, one of the 2 or 3 ways of doing it, and now that's background copy. So I still have my original in case I mess up. I can always get back to the original. So just a couple of quick techniques in Photoshop before we move on to some of the other applications, and we'll come all the way back to Photoshop at the end. All right, so now let's switch over to, for example, Adobe Illustrator. Now, Illustrator, InDesign, Muse, and other applications kind of all work the same. The layers are more about objects than they are pixels. So everything you do inside of Illustrator, every new object you create, ends up on a layer or part of a layer, even if you never touch the layers panel. Because InDesign, Illustrator, and Muse are object-based programs. Photoshop is pixel-based. So that's how the two are different, or the two sets of apps are different. So for example, if I bring up the layers panel here in Illustrator, I didn't create that layer 1. That layer 1 is created automatically the minute you create a new document or open something. So that layer 1 is there, and if you never touch layers, you'll still have a layer 1 no matter what. You can then build upon it. So now you notice in this mock-up of a website, there's a bunch of objects. There's the about text, there's the yellow box behind it, there's the Ike's Bikes logo, there's the seat, there's the bike itself. All of those are just individual objects that can be picked up and moved around like in any other object-oriented program, Illustrator, InDesign, Muse. So I said that each object is on a layer or part of a layer no matter what, whether you create the layer or not. So layer 1 is there by default, and that bike seat is actually part of layer 1 because it wasn't put on any other layer. So if I twirl down layer 1, it's going to get scary because every object on the page is in layer 1 because I've never told it to be anything different. So the one that's highlighted is the one that's selected. So that little blue square means that that's the one I'm currently working on. And so that's the object in layer 1 that can still be controlled with visibility. So I can still turn that on and off even though I didn't create any extra layers for it. Because every time you draw something or create something, like for example, if I come here and I draw a new shape, that new rectangle just appeared all by itself in layer 1. So layer 1 almost acts like a layer group like Photoshop does. It groups a bunch of layers, a bunch of things together in a layer. Now, you might say, well, if it's doing all that for me automatically, then why would I ever want to create my own layers? You would create your own layers so that you can control groups of things without having to manually go and find them one by one and turn them on and off. For example, let's say that I wanted the bikes, everything that's part of the bike, to be on a layer. So the seat and the bike itself. I want to be able to always control those two things one by one. Or I'm sorry, independent of everything else. So let's twirl this up for a second. Let's go create a new layer, and it of course calls it layer number 2. And now let's double click on layer number 2 because it's always good to name your layers. Let's call it bikes. So that means that layer 2, which is now bikes, will have anything that's part of the bike. So if I add a new tire, handlebars, brakes, whatever, I would always put that on the bikes layer. That way I'd be able to control any part of this design that has anything to do with the bikes. Now, how do I move the existing objects onto that new layer I created? Because that new layer has nothing on it right now. So I have to find them. So I twirl it down. And since these objects are not named, I have to click on them to figure out which one's which. And then I take that blue square, because remember that's what indicates what it is, indicates the selected object, and just simply drag it into the bikes layer. So now the bikes layer has that seat. And by the way, I don't have to deal with that crazy name. I can call it seat. So now that I know where it is. All right, so let's grab the whole bike itself. And that's this one. It's a group of things. So that's a clipping group. So let's go ahead and call that. We'll call it bike. It brought up a separate window to name it. All right. And now that I got that, we'll just go ahead and move that up to the same bikes layer. All right, so now I've basically taken those two sets of elements and moved them out of layer 1 into the new layer that I just created. Now, layer 1 is still layer 1, and we can call it background or whatever you want to call it, the bottom, whatever you want to call it. But notice it assigns each layer a color. That also helps you figure out, even if you don't twirl everything down, what layer something is on. So for example, if I don't have anything selected, and I click on this gold rectangle, it's got a blue bounding box around it, so I know that that's on the blue layer. If I just hover over this, I don't even have to click on it. I just hover over the bike seat, it's got a red bounding box around it. So now I know that that's the bikes layer because it's got the red. So it automatically, every time you create a new layer, assigns that new layer a color as well. So that'll help you keep organized as you're working. Okay, so with that said, hang on for a second. I don't want to miss the comments over there. There we go. All right, I see a bunch of hellos over there, and hello India, and hello Robin, and everyone else on that side of the house as well. So anyway, as we were saying, so the bikes layer, now if I turn that layer off, everything goes off with it. If I turn that layer on, everything goes on with it. If I click right to the right of the eyeball, this blank column is a locking mechanism. So now I can't accidentally click on or move the bike seat. I can click on a rectangle, but I can't do anything to the bike seat itself because it's locked. It's on a layer that's locked. You don't have to lock the entire layer. If you twirl this down and you say, well, I just want to lock the bike seat, you can twirl it down and lock individual items. So now the bike seat is locked, but the bike itself is not. So they're both on the same layer. I didn't lock the entire layer. I just locked the bike seat itself. Okay, what's another reason why you use layers other than this kind of easy to organize, easy to turn on and off groups at a time? The other reason that we use layers is to control stacking order. So for example, if I move this white rectangle right now, it is now underneath the bike seat. Why? Because remember where that white rectangle is. It's on layer 1. There it is. It's a rectangle. And we can call it my rectangle so we'll know which one it is. All right, so now my rectangle is on layer 1, and layer 1 physically is below the bike's layer. So anything on layer 1 is always going to now be underneath the bike and the bike seat. So if I just start drawing new objects and layer 1 is selected, let's draw a new object. Let's go ahead and draw an ellipse. hold down my shift key, get a perfect circle, and now that ellipse is underneath the bike seat because it's on layer 1. So we use this as a way of not only locking things down, organizing, turning things off that we don't want to see right now, but also organizing stacking order. So if I were to create yet a new layer called logos, and I were to put the logos layer above the bikes layer, and I would now take these rectangles, my rectangle, and move it up to the logos layer. Watch what happens as soon as I let go. That rectangle now appears on top because it's the topmost layer. If I were to take that ellipse that I created also and move that up to the logos layer, it's now on top. If I were to take the Ike's Bikes logo itself, find it here, it's that group, and move that up to the logos layer, it is now going to turn green, but it was already on top of everything, so it doesn't physically change. Okay, so this way now anything anywhere I put this is automatically going to be on top, and anything I put on the logos layer is automatically going to be on top of everything else because it's already on top of everything else. If I move this layer down, yes, you can change the stacking order of your layers after the fact. So now I moved the logos layer to the bottom, so the rectangle disappeared, the ellipse disappeared, and the Ike's Bikes logo disappeared because it's behind everything else on the page. If I were to move it up one layer, we see the logo again, the ellipse, and the rectangle are now behind the bike. That's the way layers have worked since day one. Okay, now let's move on to InDesign. InDesign works, and they were a little different at first. Illustrator and InDesign layers were kind of almost the same. Now they are the same. So for example, if I were to go into, Talon F is asking, what's the difference between this and Adobe's Twitch platform? It's just a different platform. With different streamers. So on the Twitch streams that are running now 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Pacific time, those are usually contractors, traditional artists, people that don't necessarily work for Adobe, whereas the Evangelist and Adobe employees actually stream on YouTube and Facebook. And then we have Adobe Live, where we have a mixture of, at adobelive.com, which is also this YouTube page, we have a mixture of both Adobe Evangelist and guests that we bring in. So that hopefully answers your question. Okay, so with that said, let's go to InDesign, and InDesign's layer panel looks very much just like the Illustrator layers panel. So it's got layer 1, which I did not create. It created that automatically. I can twirl down layer 1, and guess what? It's got every single thing that's on this page on that layer. So group 1, or the first group, is that first picture and text grouped together. If I wanted to now separate these things out, so for example, I might want to double click and rename this layer background. And then I might want to create another layer and call it photos. And then I might want to create another layer and call it text. All right, and that's typically the way you're going to deal with InDesign and Muse layers. Because in InDesign and Muse, unlike Photoshop and Illustrator, you probably won't have a ton of layers. Because InDesign and Muse's layers are document-wide, and therefore the layers that you create, you're not creating a layer for each page, you're not creating a layer for each thing, you're creating a layer for the structure of the whole document. So in this case, this would be the structure for this document. I don't care if I have 2 pages or 1,000 pages. I would want a background layer, I would want a photos layer, and I would want a text layer, and maybe 1 or 2 more. I can't think that I would need too many more past that. So in layers for Muse, same kind of thing, we'll see in a moment. But those, InDesign and Muse are pretty much your layers are going to be for organization purposes, not so much for individual graphic elements or pixels like they are in Photoshop. So for example, these groups now that are originally on the background layer, these are actually text frames and the photos themselves. So they're like grouped together. So if I really wanted to do this, what I would do is come in and let's see if I can ungroup them. So I'll ungroup those two items, and now there's a text frame and the image. So I could, for example, take the image, put it on the photos layer, and I could take the text frame and put it on the text layer. And so now for those, at least for that one group that I have, that's the photo, that's the text underneath it. If I turn them both off, they both go away. So this will allow me to keep things organized from a standpoint of layering the things I need, turning them on and off when they're in the way, locking them down when I don't want to accidentally move them, and that's pretty much it. There's not a lot of effects you're going to do layer-wise on your layers for InDesign and Muse. It's more for document organization purposes. So that's pretty much it as far as layers go in InDesign. You can, of course, lock the layer, as I said before. You can lock individual items, as we said before, just like in Illustrator, if you don't want to move that item. And you can, of course, hide the layers and turn the layers back on. Now, one of the keyboard shortcuts that kind of evolved from Photoshop is holding down your Option or Alt key to do what we call solo, to solo a layer. So for example, if you wanted to just see what's on the photos layer without having to manually go and unclick or click off all the other layers, just hold down your Option key or Alt key, click on the photos layer, it turns off everything that's not on the photos layer. Click it one more time to turn everything back on. You can also, if you had a long list of layers, you can also drag through the eye and drag up and down to turn them all off at a time. Instead of going click, 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 just click and drag down, and that will turn off a bunch of layers and turn them all back on as you drag back up. All right, so that's how layers work inside of InDesign. All right, I thought I saw a question pop up there. You're welcome, Chris. And let's see, I thought I saw something else. And hello, Marvin. All right. Let's see what we got on this side. Just make sure I'm not missing any of your good comments here. Easy to find. Okay, so Barry's saying okay, we'll get to Muse right now. I'll tell you what Barry just said. So Barry said, and we're in Muse right now, and of course this is a site with 3 pages. And like I said, when you create a layer, let's say I create a layer called Photos, no matter which page I open up, the Photos layer is there. Now Barry says he takes it up one level higher and he creates a separate layer for each page. And there's nothing stopping you from doing that. You can assign, for example, you can create a layer called Home and assign everything on the home page into that one layer. You can do that. There's nothing stopping you. It just depends on how you like to organize. But like I said, if I were to double click on Home, for example, and look at the layers panel, in this particular Muse file, they have a footer layer, a page layer, and a top nav layer. And so that's how this particular Muse file is segmented. Now, if I were to open up the About page, guess what? Same 3 layers, because the layers in Muse are site-wide, just like the layers in InDesign are document-wide. You don't create a layer for each page. You can, but if I create a home layer, even if I'm on the About page, that home layer would still be listed there because the layers are for the entire site. Now, I'm going to give you a perfect example of why you would use a layer inside of Muse. Let's go create a new page. And that new page is based on the master page. And so the master page is where everything was built for the elements, just like in InDesign, that are going to be on every page. And when I open that up, it's got the footer items and the header items. Now, if I turn off the page layer, nothing changes because there's nothing on the page layer for this page. If I turn off the page layer and I open up another page that's got content on it, then that content will disappear. Now, the footer layer contains, it's really not just the footer, so I really don't like how this one was organized. It turned off everything on the footer, but it also turned off some stuff in what I would call the top nav. The background kind of went away. So technically that background orange shouldn't be on the footer layer because I wouldn't think by turning off the footer layer that that orange should disappear, but it did. And if I turn off the top nav, then of course all the text for it disappears. Now, here's a perfect example of why you need a layer and why you also need to think about layer organization. There is a slideshow option in Muse called full screen. And when you create a full screen slideshow, it does just that. It takes over the entire screen. So let me show you. Let's go to the page layer, which is where I would think I'd want to put it. And let's go to the widget library. As a matter of fact, we'll tear off the layers panel just to keep it separate. Then we'll go to the widgets library. And in the widgets library, there's my full screen slideshow. And as soon as I drag that onto the page, it'll take over everything. Now you might be saying, well, wait a minute. You put that on the page layer, but guess what? It's above the footer layer. So everything below the page layer got covered because this slideshow is designed to go full screen. Technically, I'd want that slideshow behind everything. I still want my footer and header items to show. I just don't want that full screen slideshow to take over everything. So what I would do in this case is bring the layers panel up. And ever since the full screen slideshow came out, I've been doing this. I've been making a new layer, calling it slideshows or full screen slideshows, and putting that on the very bottom of everything. That layer is just for that one purpose, full screen slideshows. So now let's go find our full screen slideshow, the one we did, and let's move it to that bottom layer. And that's the way I would want it to actually look, with better pictures, of course, but you get the idea. I want it to be full screen no matter how wide or big this page is, but I don't want it covering the stuff that should always be there. If I did want it covering the stuff that should always be there, then I'd just put it on top, and it would cover everything else. But that's the way layers work inside of Muse. So there's really not a lot of magic to them. They turn on and turn off just like we saw before. They lock just like we saw before, and you can twirl them down to get to the individual elements to lock, move around, change the stacking order, or hide as you see fit without hiding, locking, or changing the stacking order of the entire layers. All right, so that's how layers pretty much work across Illustrator, InDesign, and Muse. Let's now go back to Photoshop and see a few more things that Photoshop has that the other applications don't have because it needs them, quite frankly. Let's pop back over to Photoshop. This is where we left off, and this is where we actually started off. And this is where we kind of talked about some layer basics. Now that we've gotten past the layer basics and we see how layers work across the board, Photoshop's got a lot more options when it comes to layers. For example, let's turn on, let's see, I'm trying to think of what I want to do here. I want to turn this layer on, not that one actually, this one. And now that I've got this layer turned on, we can see the train, and I can also see that that layer has a funky kind of icon on it. It's a smart object layer. And so that in and of itself is a different kind of layer. So here's the way to think of smart objects. You've got, or let's build a sandwich. So you've got your first piece of bread that you put down. That's the background. Then you put down maybe a piece of cheese. And that would be layer number 2. And then maybe a piece of whatever meat you're going to put on that would be layer number 3. Okay. And then maybe you put a sandwich spread on top. That'd be layer 4. Now, if you wanted to protect layer number 2, which was the cheese, and you don't ever want the cheese to change, you don't want it to get any holes in it, you don't want it to get cut, You don't want any pieces of cheese being taken away while you're building the rest of the sandwich. Then what you can do is wrap that piece of cheese into a smart object or a piece of Tupperware or cellophane that protects it from being damaged. You can do things on top of it and do things around it that show, but you're protecting what's inside. That's what a smart object is. So this train layer that I just turned on is really wrapped inside of a smart object. If I double click the smart object icon, it actually opens up the real train. So that real train, this is what's really inside that smart object layer. Now, of course, anything I do here will happen or affect the actual pixels. But if I go here, and let's say I run an effect on this train, like, actually let's run a filter on it, something a little bit more visual. So let's do a liquefy, for example. If I run liquefy on that train and just kind of distort the train like that, oh no, you're distorting the train, and you click OK, and the train is now really messed up. Well, it's really not. If I were to go back to the actual train, the train is untouched because it's wrapped inside that smart object, Tupperware, cellophane, whatever it is. So that effect only really apply to the smart object, not the actual train. And that's why smart objects can always be re-edited, turned off, turned on, or deleted. So smart objects is a way of protecting what's inside the actual layer. So for example, if I decide, oh, that was stupid, let's throw that away, I'm right back. Even if I save the file and come back tomorrow, that smart object would still be there. So that's one additional way to affect the look of something is with smart objects. Another way is another kind of layer called an adjustment layer. So at the very top here, there's an entire adjustments panel. No matter which one of these you choose, it's going to generate an adjustment layer. And thanks, Jason. I'm glad you're loving this. All right, let me make sure I'm not missing any other comments. Hello, Anissa. How are you? Thanks for sharing the broadcast. And Donna, I'm glad you're liking the tutorial. Okay, so for example, let's pick, let's pick black and white. If I were to pick black and white, and by the way, layers work in like a stacking order, so any adjustment affects everything below it. So if I were to make a black and white adjustment, bam, it makes everything black and white because that new layer that it just created is above everything else. Let me show you how we're going to affect that in just a minute. Let's go ahead and just tweak this a little bit. I know there's a lot of green in this one. So maybe we tweak that down a little bit and brighten it up a little bit. Okay, so I've got my adjustment made. The adjustment layer's been created. And now if I were to take that adjustment and move it down to be just above the background, the train is going to come back in color because that adjustment's not affecting the train anymore. The train's above the adjustment. So adjustment layers always work down. They don't affect anything above the adjustment. So the train is now above the adjustment. The train is still in color. If I turn on the other train, it's still in color because the adjustment is below both trains. Now here's something else you could think about. Let's say we move it back up. Because sometimes you'll want to use an adjustment layer just on the one layer directly below it. So in other words, I only want the top train to be black and white. I don't want the grass to be black and white. I don't want the other train to be black and white. I only want this one train to be black and white. So to do that, we hold down our Option or Alt key. This has been a long-standing hidden gem kind of trick. We put our cursor right between the two layers, and you get that kind of icon there. Let me zoom in on it so you can see it. So if I just point between the two layers, I get a finger. If I hold down my Option or Alt key, I get that, which is going to group that effect to just the layer below. So now, only that train is black and white. The rest is still in color because I grouped that effect to just that one layer below it. And of course, you can Option or Alt to ungroup it. So now it's affecting everything again, or Option or Alt click to just group that one. So that's how adjustment layers can work. And the cool thing about adjustment layers and why we love adjustment layers is because you can always get back to the original settings and you can keep tweaking. So adjustment layers don't affect the original pixels and they can always be readjusted. So if you don't like the way the black and white looks and you want to make it a little lighter, a little darker in certain areas, you can go in and can keep tweaking it to your heart's content. And because I grouped it, it's only affecting the train. Okay, all right, couple more. All right, you'll also notice, and probably one of the other two most powerful features with layers in Photoshop are masking and blending modes. So let's do masking first. Right now, we're seeing everything that's turned on. So we see all of the background, we see all of train number 2, we see all of train number 1, and we see all of the black and white effect. If I wanted to remove part of the train in the back, let's say I wanted to remove this last car. Well, I don't want to really remove it because I might need it back. So we try not to ever erase things if we can avoid it. We don't ever really want to delete something if we can avoid it, unless you are 101% sure you'll never need it again. And then you still don't want to do it. But unless you're that kind of person where, okay, I'm doing this is for me, I will never regret removing this, then chances are you don't want to remove it. So the way we get around not removing something permanently is by just simply hiding it under a mask. So when I click the train layer, or any layer for that matter, there is a menu option or a button at the very bottom of the layers panel, this kind of square or rectangle with a circle in it. That is your add layer mask. So when I click, watch what happens to the train layer. It just simply adds a little rectangle right next to it, and now you have to pick and choose which one you want to work on. If I want to work on the train, I click on the train. If I want to work on the mask, I click on the mask. So each one is got its own purpose and they're selected individually. So now I want to work on the mask. So that means that if I zoom in on the back of that train and I switch to a paintbrush and I click on and I use black paint. So the way it works with a mask, black hides whatever's on the layer, white brings it back or reveals whatever's on the layer, and shades of gray just simply make it transparent, depending on how much gray you add. So for example, I'm on black paint right now. Let's see if we can make this work. Maybe, maybe not. All right, here, we'll show it to you this way. There we go. So I'm just going to go ahead and simply bring my paintbrush back up to 100%. And now I'm hiding that last car. And because it's on a layer, I can see through it. So I'm seeing through to the background behind it. And I don't know how much of this is the last car. I guess all of this is. Just hide all of that. It looks like I'm erasing it, but I'm not. I'm just simply painting black on that mask. Let's make the brush a little smaller. And I would really zoom in, take my time, and do a good job selecting my way around the other car to make sure I got it all nice and neat. But I don't have that kind of time today, so it's going to be a quick and dirty job. All right. Good enough for an example. Okay, so now we zoom out. Yes, count 0. This will be available as soon as I end the stream. You'll be able to watch the replay. Okay, so it looks like the back of the train was never there. It's gone because I just painted on it with black in the mask. I can actually see that. And all I did to get to the mask was hold down my Option or Alt key to click on the mask to actually see it. Also, holding down your Shift key and clicking the mask will hide it. So just put a red X on the mask saying, hey, I'm going to hide your mask right now, and Shift key again will bring the mask or turn the mask back on. So masks are a great way, the best way, one of the best ways, of course, of hiding something without physically deleting or removing those pixels. All right. Okay, so masking. Definitely want to take advantage of masking when you can. Now, same thing, you notice that it added a mask automatically. I didn't add this mask for the black and white. It put a mask there for me. Any adjustment layer automatically is like a bonus feature. Comes with a mask already there. Because sometimes you want to apply effects to part of a layer. So the entire train is black and white because I said only affect the layer directly below. But it's affecting the entire layer below. So if I were to go onto the mask for the black and white effect, and I were to go in and start maybe finding something that's actually got some color in it. All right, yeah, the back of the train has color in it. I can actually bring back, I'll zoom in a little bit more so you can see it. I can actually bring back the color of this door because I'm now masking the black and white adjustment layer. So show me the door by letting me paint on it, or the window seal by letting me paint on it. Or I can switch colors, switch to white, and say, no, I didn't really mean to bring the color back of the sign on the side of the train, just the window seal itself. And then go back to black. I'm just hitting my X key. X will toggle my foreground and background. So my foreground is black, my background is white, and that way if I hit the letter X, it will toggle it, hit the letter X again, it'll toggle it back. So that way I can, just from the keyboard with one hand, switch back and forth. If I overdo it or underdo it, I can keep going. So that's a mask that's actually on the black and white adjustment layer. So I just painted that little bitty piece of black right there to hide the black and white effect only on that one spot. Do I plan to make a ghost train? Not in this episode. All right. Let's zoom out a little bit. Okay. So I said there was one other kind of layer we'd talk about. Actually, we're going to talk about two more, and then we'll call it a day. So I said masking was another important part. And I said adjustment layer, or I'm sorry, masking and blending modes. And last but not least, we'll do type. I'll talk about just how type works as a layer automatically. So blending modes. What's a blending mode for? For example, let's go bring something crazy in. Let's go to my Adobe stock library. I'll put my adjustment panel away for now. Put that away for now. Let's go back to layers. Okay. Let's make my Adobe stock panel taller. And let's go find a piece of stock photography that I have licensed. Okay, perfect example right here. Let's go ahead and bring this guy in. And I just drug in something from my library, a stock image, and notice what happened right off the bat. It created the new layer automatically. So I can, while it's still selected, I can scale them down, make them bigger, scale them down, make them smaller. We don't want to make them look like you got hit by the train. All right, never mind, don't do that. But we'll put him up here for now, like he jumps over the train. And once I'm done with the sizing, I'll commit to it. And of course, we obviously know that that doesn't look right because he's got that big white background behind him. So if I were doing this for real, I'd probably take the time to cut him off that background. But I can also experiment with blending modes to maybe not go through the trouble of cutting them out, but just to make them blend in a little bit more. Now, cutting them out would be the ultimate solution. But just for something quick, you might use a blending mode to try it. So your blending modes are at the very top of your layers panel. They start with normal, means no blending mode, it's just normal the way it would look. And then you can cycle through which ones are there to see what they do. Some of them will look like they do nothing. Dissolve did nothing. Darken almost works. The reason why darken didn't completely work is because what darken says is take any pixels on that layer that are darker than the pixels below and apply them to the pixels below. Since white is not darker than the pixels below, it made it disappear. It almost works because it doesn't completely work because he's wearing a white shirt. The white shirt's gone now. There was a reflection on the bottom of his foot. Bottom of his foot's cut off now. Same thing on the bottom of his arm. So pieces of my subject are disappearing along with the background because he has white on him. It's just like I'm on a green screen right now. If I were wearing a green shirt, I'd be looking like a floating head because the shirt would knock everything out. So while that does quickly get rid of the white background, it also gets rid of my subject as well. Now, you could go in and add a mask. You could add a mask for the blending mode and bring back parts of it. So the way you do that is duplicate your layer and apply the blending mode or apply a mask to that layer and then paint some of it back in to bring back. But that is how blending modes work. So darken's one. Multiply almost gets it. That takes the color and just simply multiplies it on top. So that brings back more of him, but it also makes everything darker. Color burn, that doesn't cut it. Unless you're trying to create that effect, then that works great. Linear burn, darken color. Lighten, which doesn't work at all for this. Screen, which doesn't work at all for this. Color dodge, linear dodge, lighten color, overlay, and you can start to see where some of them will be more successful in this case than others. So with blending modes, I usually have to try at least 2 or 3 of them to figure out which one I like best and then go from there. And there is a keyboard shortcut for blending modes to cycle through them as well. Let me go to hue, saturation, color, and luminosity. All right, so it looks like at the very top, darken works with a little work. Multiply works with a little less work. And there was one that I saw that's a cool effect. So that makes it look like I'm being artsy, even though I just didn't want to take the time to cut them out right now. There we go, artsy. All right, cool. All right, so blending modes, that's how blending modes work. All right, so I think I've covered quite a bit with, text, one more thing, text, and I was gonna say, I think I've covered quite a bit with layers. There's always a lot more to do, but layers are pretty cool. Before we do text, let's do one more thing. Since we're in Photoshop, and I mentioned effects, each layer can also have not only blending modes, but also effects. So I'm on the actual effects button at the very bottom of the layers panel. And no matter which effect you choose, you can always add more once you get the dialog box back up or up. So for example, let's say I wanted to add a drop shadow to him. Now the drop shadow, in this case, because it's a white box, is applying to the box, not the subject. So that's another reason why you want to cut them out. But anyway, if I applied a drop shadow to this, I'd be able to literally control the distance of it to the white box behind him. I can control the spread, which makes it softer. I can control the size, which is also going to make it softer. And I can control the opacity, which makes it less opaque. Now, the cool thing about any of these effects is that while you can control them from the dialogues or the sliders, you can also just pick it up, move it around. So a lot of people don't know that you can interact with an effect right on the canvas. So if I just couldn't dial in the shadow exactly where I wanted it, and then just pick it up and move it exactly where you want it, experiment. So that's another one of those hidden gems. Now, what I meant by you can always add more is because now that I've got the dialog box up, the other effects are still here. So for example, if I wanted to add an inner shadow, I can just click inner shadow and start, I don't know how much this is going to do, but I can start adding an inner shadow to that rectangle as well. So I can get like an inner shadow going on. And that actually looks kind of cool. I like that better than the outer shadow. And of course, I can turn off the drop shadow and just leave the inner shadow on. That actually works. So any one of these, and any one, this is kind of new in CC, any one of these with a plus sign means that you can duplicate it. You can have more than one. So for example, let's say you did a color overlay. And let's make the color overlay not be covering the object completely. So let's say we did a multiply. And let's also say we bring up a color. And let's also say we drop the opacity down. Okay, so we got that color overlay there. If I want another color overlay, click the plus sign. Now I got a second color overlay. And I can make the second one different. I can make it a different color. And so now I'm blending those two colors together. And of course, I can control the opacity of each color to get different effects on each color. So, and of course, any of these, even once you click OK, you say, oh, I don't really like the color overlays or the shadow or any of the above, then just hide them because they're all part of the layer and they're non-destructive. So that way I can see the green or see just the blue or see no color and just the inner shadow or no shadow but just the color. You can toggle those on and off as needed. And you can always, of course, add more if you need more. Text. I was going to say, was that it? All right, so text. Let's grab our type tool. And we're going to just type the word runaway. Now, that automatically created a type layer. As soon as I click OK, it'll even name the layer whatever I typed. So that type layer, I can always go back to it. I just hit Command-T or Control-T on Windows. I can size that type. I can always go back to the type and choose a different font, different style. Something, all right, let's do it this way. Something heavy. So it'll show me all my heavy fonts, and let's get a nice typekit font in there. F for heavy. And here's another cool thing we can do. Let's move this down. Size that down a little bit more. And let's bring in another image. Something like a forest scene, but not the same forest scene. Just trying. Oh, let's go ahead and lock that in first. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to get another forest scene out of stock. See if I've got one. If not, we'll find one. Let's just go find one. Search for forest. Let's get images, not vectors. All right, this one looks kind of close. Okay, so let's go ahead and just drag this one over. Now, of course, I haven't licensed this image yet. I'm just testing it. But once I get that image in, it's a low-res preview. I can now see what I did here. Okay, so I brought in the new stock image, which is called Forest Trail, and it's above my text called Runaway. If I were to do that same group trick, now Forest Trail is inside my text. And I can still pick up the forest trail and move it around inside my text. So these are the kinds of things that Photoshop layers can do that you just don't get inside of InDesign, not even so much Illustrator, but definitely not InDesign and Muse. Because you can just do cool effects and cool things like this all day long in Photoshop. And it's all non-destructive. I haven't changed a single pixel of any of these layers. I didn't delete any of him or delete his white background. I didn't change anything that I can't change with the text. I can do any of this and just keep playing all day long. So if I wanted to change what this says, just to prove the point, go back to the type layer, select the text, and call it train. So now I've got train forest text. So either way, non-destructive workflows happen when you use layers. It's not going to always be non-destructive. There's some point you will change pixels, but certainly Photoshop layers and effects and smart objects and adjustment layers and masking goes out of its way to make it so that you don't have to change your pixels or flatten anything down, unless you just run into a situation where you have to. And then in that case, duplicate the layer first, and then you can at least have one to go back to. Now, here's another just last minute trick. Let's say I want to see that inner shadow on the type. I can just simply drag that effect up and drop it, and it now will apply it to the type layer. So effects can be moved just like layers from one layer to the next. If I wanted to duplicate it, I'd hold down the Option or Alt key and drag it with that key held down. Now it's in both places. So now it's still on the text, and it's now on the dance and music guy. All right, someone said don't forget to name your layers. My layers are named. So I don't have anything called layer 1 or layer 2. Whew. All right, I know what you're thinking, but Terry, the train is still off the tracks. You're right. Last but not least, let's fix the train. All right, let's do edit. Let's go to perspective warp. And let's go ahead and put a grid here. And we're going to put a grid here. All right, now let's fix this one. All right, so what I'm doing is I'm putting a grid the way with perspective warp, the way the train currently is aligned. Something like that. All right. So now that I got my perspective warp grid kind of in the same alignment as the existing train, then I can just switch over and click on warp instead of layout. And now we can have Soul Train. Now keep in mind, there's a mask there, so I'm about to pull it out from under the mask. So I have to go back and remask. But we can go ahead and twerk the train down onto the track. All right, and we have to go back and do some more masking, but you get the idea. So now that we got that, go back to the mask and go back to our paintbrush and our black paint and a bigger brush. And just adjust our mask. Because we moved the train, we should have moved the train first before doing the mask. There we go. That's it. Oh my God, I know, isn't it cool? So, hope you guys got something out of this. Masking, layers, use adjustment layers, use type layers. Well, anytime you put type, you're going to have layers. Layer groups, all kinds of very cool things you can do. Twerk the train. Yes. All right, new single coming soon. So, thank you guys for joining me. It's been a blast. Let's see. Sorry, that was not targeting your work. Just a reminder, best practice. Okay, no problem. Count 0. And let me make sure I just didn't miss any extra questions here. Yep, always name your layers. Oh, I see what you mean. Yes, always name your layers. And let's see what we got here. Photoshop does rule, but sometimes you need vectors. All right. Yep, you will be able to watch the replay. Thanks, Count 0, for doing that. All right, let me make sure I didn't miss any on this side as well. Okay, I think I saw all the questions. If you got a last minute question, go ahead and type it in real quick. And hopefully we'll get it before we disconnect. Well, you're welcome. You're welcome. You're welcome. Hi, Kaylee. Child Prodigy, thank you. You're welcome, PT Nevins. And happy Friday, everybody. All right. Dun, 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 dun. Guides on layers. Depends on the application. I'd have to think about it for a minute. Guides on layers. Yes and no. Each application handles it a little differently. You'd have to go and experiment with each one. I can't think of which ones allow you to do it and which ones don't, but I know some do and some don't. All right. See you later. That was good. Benzie, that was good. That was a good one. All right. All right. I think that's it. All right. Cheers, everybody. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one. I'm going to stop the stream now. Bye-bye. See you next week.